I'd like to ask Chris to talk about, from the business and technology perspective, whether there's an effectiveness component here when you're talking about that if you're minimizing what you're taking in, if that has an implication for how effective the analysis may be, or if there are any lessons learned from the private sector on the scope of data you're taking in for these purposes.
Okay. So, Sharon, you remember the conversation correctly. I agree with Jim on this. I think it's almost a contradiction in terms to be talking about data mining and data minimization. And I think, therefore, to answer your question directly, if you're in the private sector, you are going to be focused on what the scope of your activity is going to be, and you're going to want to bound that as clearly and explicitly as possible so that you don't waste resources gathering things that you don't need for your purpose, right? Now, there are clearly different objectives and motivations between the public and the private sector, but there are a lot of commonalities as well. And I think the report, one of the good things the report does is it forces an agency to think about what it is we're doing and how are we going to try to accomplish it, right? I don't think that's an unreasonable request of anybody, whether you're in intelligence, law enforcement, or selling, shoes, right, over the web. So I think that this whole question at the design phase of what is it we're doing and why are we collecting, why do we think we need to collect the information that we're collecting, can very easily support this concept of data appropriateness. And I think it's unnecessary to talk about data minimization, quite honestly, because I think that what an individual is interested in, whether the individual is executing the program objectives or whether the individual is concerned about their privacy, is whether or not information is going to be used in an irrelevant way. And so I think if you have this concept of, you could have lots of information that's not relevant to my situation, and it may be non-harmful or non-intrusive to me, and I probably wouldn't care that you have all that information. But I really care if you have the inappropriate information that somehow comes back and affects me. So I think the structure and the design point around data appropriateness versus data minimization is just is more central. And quite honestly, the amount of information that's being connected, generated, as you've referred to, as I talked about in my remarks, is going to continue to be extensive and voluminous. And so data minimization may be an ideal, but it might not be a reality.
Okay, I'd like to turn now to Paul Pillar. You talked a little bit in your opening remarks about trying to connect the dots and to what extent that's just the benefit of hindsight when we look back. But going forward, using maybe the Christmas Day bombing attempt of last year as an example, or other examples that may be better suited, how might data mining be, in the terrorism context, a helpful tool potentially, despite all the caveats that we've floated here? How can you see that maybe playing a helpful role when done correctly?
It plays a helpful role by improving the odds that the appropriate human intervention, to use Mary Ellen's term, resources by law enforcement or intelligence agencies will glom onto and catch and prevent the next terrorist plot. It's still just a matter of odds. And by the way, I agree wholeheartedly with Jim that in the backwards look at something like the December incident, there's a heavy political element. And one should be skeptical about just how much could have been accomplished in this or any other incident through data mining techniques. But that's true of any other counterterrorist techniques. There isn't some alternative out there to which we can turn and say, this is the key to catching that next terrorist plot, so let us not do this privacy intrusion procedure that we've talked about with regard to data mining. So again, it's a matter of changing odds. It's not a matter of certainty, and it's not a matter of outright prediction.
For Jim Harper, you've written actually about how difficult it is to apply data mining techniques in the counterterrorism context based on having so few, fortunately, data points. Can you talk a little bit about whether you think data mining can ever be an effective tool in that context?
Well, I suppose
were you going to bring in copies? Are they different?
There are copies of a policy analysis
we've made copies available.
that I co-authored a few years ago on this question the the utility of data mining for that purpose maybe lies on a continuum. Data mining works when it has a high level, produces a high level of confidence that a pattern you've seen in the future will repeat itself. So if you've got a 90% relationship between purchases of butter and bread, it's predictive. I think it's a use of the term that's appropriate to call it predictive, that most of the time people who are buying butter are going to buy bread. If it's less predictive, if you have a lower confidence rate in the pattern you're using, maybe it's not predictive. Maybe it can improve the odds. But this hindsight bias that so distorts our conversation about incidences like Fort Hood and Captain Underpants really ruin people's expectations. I think data mining works when it's predictive. I don't see there's a way that it is predictive of terrorism. So in that sense, it doesn't work. Paul's correct that much lower down on the confidence vector, you can use data mining to waste fewer resources. I just don't think people should put a lot of eggs into the basket that there's some technological solution that would have taken care of this. We're gonna wring our hands as long as we believe that some failure to connect the dots was the problem. Just plan on wringing your hands about failures to connect the dots for the foreseeable future. The thing I've been arguing with respect to recent controversies that Mary Ellen has cautioned us away from discussing is that we might want to consider risk acceptance.
Mary Ellen didn't caution at all. Mary Ellen said it wasn't data mining.
Right.
Like let's be very clear,
well, it's
Jim.
not like I really want.
We've had this conversation publicly a couple of times.
I was going to say we shouldn't make the pat down situation a subject here, but what I've argued there
your choice, Jim.
is risk acceptance. What I've argued there is risk acceptance. In 99 million flights, transporting 7 billion passengers over the last decade, Al-Qaeda's zenith, 0 domestic flights have had a bombing. That's a low risk, given what we know, and it might be that the public should be able to accept that kind of risk if the alternative is this other stuff. So, okay, it kind of maybe might work if you're willing to accept a low enough correlation among sets of data, but probably not.